Thanks for being here this morning. I'm very excited to be here with Gail Lord and Stephanie Manasseh to talk about the established city. We're not going to talk about German philosophy this morning.
Oh.
I know you're disappointed. I think Jeff Koons satisfied that for all of us. I wanted to begin with some vocabulary questions. Gail, now we're going to breathe. What makes an established city? What is an established city?
That's a great question. So I gave it a little bit of thought because I kind of knew you were going to ask it. And established city in a way is in the eye of the beholder. For some people, it's New York, it's Paris, it's Los Angeles, and we've talked about those places. I thought I might reflect on two established cities that were both established in the 1300s. And so I think we could all agree that that's established if they go back to 1300. And they've changed so much over the years. And I think that this comes to the point that Diane made in his talk, which is that cities are always changing, they're always reinventing themselves. And so an established city becomes a destroyed city, and we've seen that happening. And a destroyed city rises again like the phoenix, and we've seen that happening. So I wanted to think about Mexico City a bit. It actually was established in 1300. It was destroyed by the Spanish. It was revived and became a great city, and it's a great city today. In fact, it's number one on the New York Times must-visit list. So I think that we have to say that cities are never static. And they're places that lift the spirit.
All right. Second vocabulary question. Stephanie, you are with the Accessible Art Fair in Brussels. What does accessible mean? Accessible to whom? Accessible how?
Well, I'll give a little bit of background about the Accessible Art Fair. I started it 10 years ago. I arrived in Belgium and I started meeting lots of artists, and I realized that these artists don't have a voice and they don't have a platform. So what I decided to do is to give these artists without gallery representation, give them a nice platform to meet an audience and to bring the audience to them. So accessibility is not anything to do with money and making things affordable, but rather making the audience accessible to the artist and the artist accessible to the audience. That's my goal. So that's what accessibility means to me.
And it's interesting that you've done that in Brussels, which is a city that is in some ways established but also emerging. How has that fair fit a little bit in the context of that particular city?
Well, it's funny because I think Brussels has started off as an established city and now has become an emerging city because of all the communities that are coming together thanks to the European institutions that have arrived so many years ago. So it's a constantly evolving city, and all these cultures merging together. And actually, Brussels has a new voice. And there's the French and the Flemish, and now all of these different cultures coming together, and it creates a very vibrant city.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we hear a lot about Brussels as the seat of the European Union, and it's also a place with a lot of artists and a lot of galleries. A lot of galleries have opened there in recent years, a lot of taking advantage of French taxes. Frankly, a lot of French people have moved to Brussels, or the tax rates are a little bit more favorable there, so there are actually a lot of new galleries and a real vibrancy, I found. Gail, have you worked in cities? You are a cultural consultant and have worked on thousands of projects all around the world. Can you talk a little bit about some of the projects that you've done that have helped transform the texture of different cities? Which ones come to mind?
Well, one that came to mind this morning, one's mind just kind of goes round and round these things, is a city called Salford. I don't know, I hope somebody's heard of it, but it's basically regarded often as a suburb of Manchester. Salford in the 19th century, it's an ancient, it's a medieval city originally, so many cities have quite a long history. In the 19th century, it was actually the poorest city in Europe. Marx and Engels wrote about it as the most horrific. Engels, of course, was living in Manchester at the time, as by far the poorest city in Europe, the most oppressed conditions. And in the 1960s, in the post-war years, it became again the most impoverished city in Europe. And by the time they got to the 1980s, it was still the most impoverished city in Europe. Incredible to know. And the people there decided, the city fathers decided that they wanted to build an opera house. And that seemed like a kind of a mismatch in a way, and it was. The project failed, and then they decided to build a cultural center. They decided to clean the water from the Manchester Ship Canal, which they did. There's salmon swimming in that water today, and people can go swimming in it. It was one of the most polluted bodies of water, I'd say probably in the world at the time. And they built a fantastic cultural center that used, and I think that this is really the essence of it. It's about it's not about imposing somebody else's idea. Why did they think of opera? Because they thought of the Sydney Opera House effect. They wanted a Sydney Opera House. Everybody at that time wanted a Sydney Opera House. But instead what we did, and I'm very proud that I was involved in this, was we discovered the work of L.S. Lowry, who I don't know if that's any name recognition, but he's actually...
Can you say that name one more time?
L.S. Lowry.
L.S. Lowry.
Yeah, he's a 20th century artist.
Fantastic.
Painted, yeah, you know.
Of course, yeah.
You don't.
I
That's
do.
Great, okay.
Of course.
So he actually painted working class life. He was an outsider. Today we'd probably call him an outsider artist. But and the greatest collection of his work was in the basement of the City Museum. So the project evolved around sort of saving the collection, moving it from the basement into a beautiful space designed by Michael Wilford in the James Sterling Partnership. Was about 8 years of work. And it's now, well, to give you an idea, when they competed for the BBC of the North, where would it locate, which is the children's programs, the sports programs, very important, Salford actually won over Manchester.
Ah.
And so today you have the Salford Centre, you have hotels, you have a cut-rate shopping mall, I think that Lowry would have turned over in his grave, but such is life and death. And and you have the BBC of the North. So that's a very complete transformation.
When did you work on that project?
Well, it opened in 2000, so
okay.
basically through the 90s.
Okay. And was that something where when you went there, you were in conversations with people in the city to figure out what's particular and unique and special about this place? Like it must be a kind of a conversation. You come in and you say, let me respond a little bit to what I'm finding here on the ground.
Totally. That's a very good question. Thanks. Yeah. So of course we're working with the city council, and this was I don't know how many of you remember when there was such a thing as the loony left in the north of England. That was they weren't loony at all because they just were very left-wing cities, and this was obviously one of them. And the mayor. I had to go to a lot of meetings of city council, along with the architects, of course, to explain the project. I mean, it's a very expensive project. And by the way, it won the RIBA award for the year 2000, which was the millennial year. So it was quite a big thing. And he said, Mrs. Lord, he said, are you sure? Are you really sure that Lowry is a good enough artist? I mean, it's also, there's 3 theaters, there's bars, there's restaurants, there's a lot more than just Lowry. And of course, this has happened to me many times, because what happens in cities that become impoverished or disabled due to war, to economic calamity, many things that happen in cities, is people lose confidence in their own culture. They lose confidence in who they are. And that's happened many, many times in many, many cities and many places. And so I had to kind of give that economics 101 talk, or maybe it's 301, anyway, which is that, he's really important. Why doesn't the Tate show him more? If he's really important, because he doesn't fit into the canon of contemporary art. He isn't part of what people think is important in art right now. But when it comes to the masses of people, they think it's very important because it reflects their lives. So, there's a lot of conversation. I could go on and on, but...
No, it's interesting. I mean, I think that in the conversation about an emerging city and how to help make an emerging city emerge, it's like you go in and kind of help cities listen to themselves.
Exactly.
I've written your ad copy.
Yeah, right.
Very good.
No,
Got it.
you have to, because you can't just necessarily come in from on high, but you also have to have a driving vision of a project. And I think that what's helped make cities emerging is a combination of factors, kind of ground up things happening, and then people with vision and with money coming in and saying, actually, we have this great idea for a project.
They benefited from being the poorest city in Europe because they got ERDF funding at the time, and that became part of the vision. So there wasn't really like a wealthy philanthropic class, if you like, but perhaps there is today.
Well, we'll add that city to the list of New York Times places to go this year.
Oh,
Maybe.
would they ever
I don't
be
know. I've
thrilled?
never been.
Yeah. They have a good cricket team. Well, people who know soccer, of course, will know Salford because the Old Trafford is there. You know, it's a big deal for people in the sports world.
Stephanie, back to Brussels, emerging established city. Did you tell us a little bit about this year's Accessible Art Fair? When is it going to be held, and how's it going to work exactly?
Well, this year is our 10th anniversary.
Oh my God.
Yeah, 10 years already.
Happy anniversary.
Passed fast. And we've decided to do it in a very special place. I was invited to meet the director of the Musée Juif de Belgique, where unfortunately there was the shooting, the attack 2 years ago, where 5 people died. And since then they closed the doors for renovations, but also to get over this tragedy.
For those who don't speak French, that's the Jewish Museum of
The
Brussels.
Jewish Museum, of Belgium.
Of Belgium, okay.
And so they invited me for a conversation, and they asked me whether I would be interested in doing the Accessible Art Fair within the museum. And it took me a while to consider it because, of course, putting a business inside that sort of realm, I mean, it's risky, and there's lots and lots of things to consider. But I took my time and I spoke to people, and I thought, you know what, this is the right thing to do. It's time to make this museum live again. And how we're going to do that is to bring in young, emerging talent within those 4 walls to bring it back, to bring the museum back to the public sphere, and to invite audiences that don't necessarily go to art fairs or to museums, to bring those audiences into that realm. And I'm really excited about it. We're going to introduce 60 emerging artists and have all sorts of performances and all sorts of things happening for those 4 days, and relaunch the Jewish Museum of Brussels, of Belgium.
I think that sounds like a great idea. I mean, it's the climate in Brussels and in some ways in Paris has been very tense with shootings in recent years, and the one at the Jewish Museum in Brussels in May of 2014
well, that's
was
it. And
particularly
certain people
jarring.
have said,
People are
it's
afraid to go
risky.
in.
Exactly. But, the Bataclan is going to open again, and of course people are going to go back there, and people are not going to stop sitting in cafes because of the risks. So, let's put that aside and move forward and say that we are not afraid.
And culture is a way to do that, an important way. What are the criteria for the accessible artists included in your fair? How do you decide who's accessible?
So we get together, we put together a very good jury of art professionals. So it's a bit out of my hands now, thankfully. I don't have to make that decision. I don't have that pressure to decide who participates. So I put it in the hands of these, art specialists and various people working in the arts. And we get about 300 applications for 50 spots. And we spend the whole day deciding who can take part. And really, they just have to have a body of work that is to sell, because that's the objective of the art fair, like traditional art fairs. And we base it on the quality. We don't look at their CVs, we don't look at their histories. We're just looking at their present, and we judge them on that.
And may I ask the vulgar question, the pricing? I mean, is it often, is that a consideration too? I mean,
not really. But I think that an artist who's not yet in galleries and doesn't have, at least, a certain amount of experience under his or her belt, they can't really demand high prices. So in a way, that's accessible, making art accessible. But we're not. I would never ever talk about it as affordability. No, I mean the artists decide their pricings, but we want to make sure that first-time buyers can also purchase works of art and giving them the access as well to artworks.
And some after that are probably picked up by galleries.
Absolutely. No, we've had a few. We're in our 10th year now, so we've had a few that have been discovered and have moved on to wonderful things.
And Brussels, again, established emerging city. It has so many galleries, and it has a huge, long tradition of collectors. Some of the most sophisticated and historic collectors in the world are in the area. I mean,
Absolutely.
dating back.
Actually, there's a statistics. I think that Belgium has more art collectors per capita than anywhere else. So there is money and there is engagement in the arts. And of course, we have these wonderful established art fairs like Art Brussels, and the Independent is coming now, which is very exciting. So things are moving in our little country of Belgium, in the lowlands. Things are happening, and it's quite exciting.
Yeah, I was there last April, actually, for the first time, and I was really taken aback in a good way by how much was going on there, and there are non-profits working, and there are cultural institutions like Wiels, which is a contemporary art space, which at the time had this wonderful performance by Anna-Theresa de Kiersmacher, the dancer, who had organized a performance called Work, Arbeit, in the museum, and people were coming to just watch these dancers. We know that as Marina Abramovich was an innovator in this, but the museum becomes a space also for movement, for dance, for performance. And in fact, that piece is now at the Pompidou in Paris. It got its start in Brussels, and then it went to a bigger venue. I wonder if anyone in the audience has any questions. Roger Cohen, my colleague in the front row. Another mic is arriving.
Is this on? Yeah. That was fascinating. Stephanie, if I may, that's a really bold and courageous decision to hold the next art fair in the Jewish Museum of Belgium. Accessible, how will you reconcile accessibility and security, which is really a fundamental issue of our age, security versus freedom? It's become really one of the fundamental issues in all our societies. So you're holding the accessible art fair in a place that is a very visible target.
Yes.
How do you deal with that?
Well, actually, we're still at level 3 in Belgium, security-wise, which means that there are 2 armed guards outside of the museum at all times. In effect, then, we are more secure there than we are in the Beaux-Arts, for example, where there is no security. So I won't advertise that on my website or through social media to say, okay, well, we're safer than. I think people themselves will decide whether they feel safe enough to come or not. And I think you're right that it is a bold decision, but I think it's for the individual to see whether they feel that it's right for them. But there is security that's been put in place by the state, by the museum, and that I will also put into place.
It's a good question. I think a lot of museums across Europe are facing that. In Paris, they've increased security at all museums, and there really is this sense that culture, the things that these cities stand for, is under threat.
But you see, next year I'll be holding the Accessible Art Fair. This is, at the museum is for 1 year only while they're in refurbishments. But next year I'll hold it at the Beaux-Arts in Belgium, in Brussels.
You want to talk a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, it's part of the Palais des Beaux-Arts, and it's a contemporary space where they show all sorts of wonderful exhibitions. And I'll be renting out a space there. But you see, there are no security guards there, so actually I would feel less safe holding it there than I would at the Jewish Museum.
Interesting. Maybe they'll add them.
Yeah, maybe, thanks to this.
A question, yes. Wait, the microphone's arriving, Your Excellency.
Stephanie, I was wondering, with the Accessible Art Fair, what is the format? Are galleries representing artists, or are you the gallery in a fair? And if there are no galleries, then how are you determining the prices of these emerging artists?
Well, the artists themselves, thank you for that question, the artists themselves are present. So that is the unique selling point of the Accessible Art Fair, is that every stand is represented by the artists and they take over their space. So in effect, they're present for the 4 days or the 5 days of the art fair, depending on what we decide to do this year. But they're there and they engage with the public and they can give all of the background about their inspiration and about their techniques and everything. So you get it directly from the artists themselves. But I have no exclusivity with these artists. I don't sign any exclusivity. In terms of pricing, yeah. So we give them the freedom to really have their space and determine the pricing. Of course, we can help them. I have the experience now. I have 10 years experience doing this, so I know what sells, and I usually give my insight into it. But it's up to them, really.
A question here in the middle of the row.
Hi. I wonder if maybe both of you could reflect a little bit on how the maybe anti-establishment cities get more acknowledgement. I think we tend to be very, certainly in this conference, quite Eurocentric in terms of the cities. And I think, Gail, speaking to Salford or Mexico City, there's all these other fantastic cities in the world. And I just wonder how culture is used in making those cities be more acknowledged, not only in their own environment, but I think globally.
Gail.
So this is, I think I understand the question. It's about acknowledging the under-acknowledged. Is that it? Yeah. Well, I think that, Richard Florida has kind of given a formula, kind of stir and shake formula for how cities can join the world of knowledge. Right? To say, there are many cities that are very much in production. They produce the goods and services that we all need. They're just, for the most part, I'm not too sure who's in the audience, but for the most part, they're no longer in the north and the west. They're in the east and the south. So cities, though, are open places. They're places that generally welcome. They need employees. They need a labor force. They need consumers. And so they're opening to immigration and migration. Of course, migration is people moving from the countryside to the city, and immigration is people who are one way or another crossing borders. So cities today, cities in the medieval period had their own borders. They had walls. But today, it's countries that are building walls, and cities are actually the open place. And so I think that it's the openness of the city, the openness to the tourist, the openness to the migrant, the openness to the immigrant that creates a kind of cauldron of ideas. And the cauldron of ideas can lead to the production of art, and there are many, many, many forms in which art is displayed. And I guess it's a dance, or maybe a slow walk, I'm not sure which, but between the production of new meaning, which is what art is, the production of new meaning, and I think we saw in Marina's presentation a fantastic example of how art produces new and unexpected meanings among participants that builds confidence. I think that cities need confidence to have democracy in itself, to have discourse in itself, and I think actually people more and more are discovering these cities.
You worked well, I'm going to ask one more question. You worked on Bilbao, which for so many years has been seen as the example, the Bilbao effect. You build a museum, people come, you turn a kind of, a post-industrial economy into a cultural economy. Is that model still a working model?
Right. Okay, I have to say that we didn't work on the creation of that museum. We do a lot of those, but that's not one of them. We worked for 12 years with the museum, with the Guggenheim in Bilbao, on their strategic planning. So we actually got to see the aftermath, the reality. So the first reality is, yes, unbelievable success story. They've had between 800,000 and 1 million visitors consistently for over 10 years. There actually is
Each year.
Yeah, every year. And usually in that sector, there's a peak and then there's a decline. And then there has been no decline. The museum has paid for itself in terms of tax returns over and over and over again. And the statistics are very well known and very well published. But there were other really interesting problems that you learn about through a consultative strategic planning process. I just say one of them was a tremendous gulf with contemporary artists. And so then the museum started to work closely with them. But you can ask the question, people said, are we a tourism destination or are we a museum? And that was a struggle for them.
For the institution to figure
very
out.
much so.
And they worked with contemporary artists, you said? Or
Now
there was
they
a
do.
gulf that
There
that
was
they
a
needed to
gulf,
bridge
and over 10 years they bridged it.
by bringing more contemporary artists and...
And by doing projects and by welcoming them, yeah.
No, it's interesting. Other audience questions? Farah.
Gail, I've been listening to what you're saying, and I read your title up on the screen, but can you explain exactly what your company does or what you do, like concretely?
Okay, well, we don't have a day, but anyway, basically we're a consulting organization. We do cultural planning. So we recently completed a cultural plan for the city of Chicago. For the city of Chicago, which resulted in Chicago starting an architecture biennale, because they have great modern architecture, which again is under-recognized in the world. That's actually a great example of a city that all international travelers just flew over. Mayor Rahm Emanuel wanted to make a change. That was one of the many, many changes that came out of the process. We also plan cultural institutions in 3 categories: buildings, exhibitions, and the business plan. Thank you for asking.
You gave a presentation yesterday about soft power, which
Yeah.
is very much a guiding principle.
Thank
Another audience question.
Stephanie, I wanted to return to this question of accessibility differently from Roger's take on it, which is the accessibility to the artist. Can you go back 10 years and think about what drove you to kind of that moment? Because there's a lot of conventional wisdoms that artists really aren't competent at being able to articulate their stories and talk about their work. And obviously we've seen 2 examples of, in the last 2 days with Jeff and Marina, that give us a lot more intimacy into their work. So 1, what inspired you to do it? And 2, what happens on the floor during the fair in terms of artist and potential collector interaction?
Thank you, Aaron. So first of all, I want to say, how great is it to get insight into Marina's work or into Jeff's work? I mean, this is really what I try to do with my artists, is to give, the visitor that experience, maybe not to that level as Marina, not yet, but to give, all the insight possible that you can get from the artist directly from their mouths. I think that that you can't compare that to any experience. But going back 10 years, actually it goes back 40 years, so now you know my age. My mother is an artist, and I saw how she struggled, to find a gallery to represent her, and she's very good. She's still painting in her 70s. But I witnessed the struggle over the years. So what I decided to do when I arrived in Brussels, I put together a couple of artists. It was about under 10 artists. I think it was 8 or 9. And I started the Accessible Art Fair, and we had, I don't know, maybe 200 visitors. And since then, it's really evolved. But it's the concept, and at its source, it stays the same. It really is about meeting the artist and getting as much insight as possible into the artist's vision.
A question here.
Yes, I have a question. How you present young artists if he's doing immaterial form of art? No one gallery going to present this because it's nothing to sell. So that's a real problem. How immaterial actually art can be sold? How you solve this problem?
how do we solve this problem?
Because, you know, the gallery will not present such artists. But
So
still can be
immaterial, you meaning?
immaterial, like, you know, performance.
Yeah, that's really
This is
difficult.
the, you know, the time-based art. Was always been my problem, because in a way, how you deal with this. You know, it's very important. One of the in historical moment when this kind of immaterial art was sold. This was in 1956. Yves Klein sold artist sensibility on the bridge of Seine to the collector, and he say, "I'm selling you artist sensibility." Collector say, "How much?" He take the checkbook and make the check. The Yves Klein take a match and burn the check, and ashes go to the Seine. But this is historical piece. It's so important part of history.
Yes.
And still, it was no actually material transaction. It's really interesting how this kind of artists can make this incredibly important historical works. How they can live if you actually there's no anybody who present them.
I know. Well, that's exactly it. And you could probably give some insight into your experience, but it's really difficult. It really is about bringing together the right people and being, you know, for the artist to be in the right place at the right time and to meet, you know, museum directors. And what I try to do is to invite all of these people, and sometimes they come, sometimes they don't. Some artists are discovered, some are not. But yeah, it's a challenge. I know it's a challenge for artists.
I think it's not just this challenge for artists, but I think that have to be a completely new type of education of the collectors.
Yeah,
how
I
they
think
can
you're right.
actually take into consideration this kind of work. It's really about education.
Yeah. Well,
Marina,
maybe we can talk about that afterwards. It would be interesting to see.
Is the model more almost like a musician or a performer? You have to have a gig in a museum or a gallery, maybe. Has that been your? Is that your sense of how the field for non-material art operates now?
It's more complicated than this. We can have later on.
All right.
discussion,
Well,
but
we'll
it's
have
really
another
about
panel on that.
general
to discuss.
education of the collector and the museum directors
Yes.
and the gallerist.
Actually, I was reminded that the place Marina and I met was Salford.
That's fine.
There you go. Do we have time for one more question? One more question. Front row.
I wanted to thank you because I think that what you're doing, I'm talking to Stephanie because Gail, I know what you're doing is fantastic, but I'm discovering Stephanie. I'm just having, I want to compliment the word accessibility because we're talking about money here, and we're talking about, okay, meeting the artists themselves. But I think we can complement together a lot because to answer Marina's question, with what I'm doing now with my TV channel, is that we're building up a Spotify model, meaning artists, if they come on my platform, my TV channel, which is now everywhere in the world, like I told you yesterday, and specifically in Qatar, you could have this possibility to meet, to make this introduction and to prepare the people before. This is everything about art before. Everybody in this room, we observe the art before buying it. Okay. And so this is where I think we could show your artist in order to prepare the eye of the
Thank you
people
very much for the.
Well, we try to do that, you know, with the artists. We try to record them. We do YouTube videos of them in their studios working to give. You know, an introduction before the art fair. So this is something...
Nothing beats the real thing, right?
Nothing beats the real thing.
Thank you very much. On
Thank
to the next
you, Rachel.
panel.
Thank you.